All right. Moving on then in Blood Meridian. This next section is the middle section, the middle 10 chapters here from 6 to 16, which details the kid's exploits with the Glanton gang. Him and Toadvine join the Glanton gang all the way down to when they are massacred by Yuma Indians at a ferry which they've hijacked, and they're trying to they're going back and forth over the Colorado River trying to make money off of it, and then the Indians massacre them. Note that the massacre of Captain White's army by the Comanche is a foreshadowing of that massacre. One thing about McCarthy is that he always foreshadows. He's a master of the art of foreshadowing. Coming events are always casting their shadows backward in time in McCarthy. Sometimes it's just a chapter ahead. Sometimes, as in the case of the two massacres of the two groups that the kid finds himself with, it's well ahead. But either way. So then with chapter 6 now, we recall that Toadvine, the kid had met in the jail in Chihuahua City. The kid had met Toadvine, so they reconnected. And Toadvine connects the kid with this veteran of the Mexican-American Wars named Granny Rat. I guess they call him that because he's a veteran. And he tells this strange story, which is a foreshadowing of the Glanton gang, which then a few paragraphs later the kid meets, where he says that during the war they had gone into a cave and there were all these Native Americans there. At first he says they're Native Americans, and you think they're living Native Americans, but as it turns out, they're actually mummies. They're mummified Native Americans, and that when they try to carry them out of the cave and they take the bodies out of the cave air, they disintegrate when they hit the cave air. But then some of the Americans, Granny Rat says, go back into the cave and scalp. They try to scalp these mummies and sell the scalps in Durango, and it doesn't really work. Interesting story, but there again, it's foreshadowing. And then right around the corner comes the judge, who is already joined up. We last saw the judge in Nacogdoches disrupting Reverend Green's sermon, and now here he is already joined up with the Glanton gang. Later on in chapter 10, we'll find how the Glanton gang hooked up with him, which I think is one of the best chapters in the book, the gunpowder chapter. That one's a good one. So here they come riding around the corner. The Mexican authorities, the Governor Trias, has hired them to scalp Indians, and he's paying a handsome sum for it, especially for their leader named Gomez. And once again, the judge smiles when he first sees the kid, or the kid thinks he does. He's not sure. It's an ambiguous, maybe Mona Lisa type smile. He's not really sure. Last time he saw him as he was leaving the town and the hotel was burning down, the judge had smiled icily at him. So there's an interesting sort of kinship between them. And Sepich says in his notes on Blood Meridian that he thinks the model for the kid is actually Samuel Chamberlain, who wrote an autobiography called My Confessions about his time with the Glanton gang. And Judge Holden is described in there. And his antipathy, Chamberlain's antipathy as a younger man toward the judge, might be reflected in the antipathy between the judge and the kid in the narrative here. So it's possible that we don't know who he had in mind for the kid, if anyone at all. But so then they get going. In chapter 7, they go to the house of a man named Speer, who is a Dutch, or I forget if he's a Dutch or an Austrian, a gun runner. And so he opens up some guns that are left over, I think, that he was not able to sell during the Mexican-American War. They were left over from that war, and they go and get some guns. And then we first start to see the nature of Glanton, who is the putative leader of the group. It is called the Glanton gang, but it becomes clear that the judge is really calling the shots here. And Glanton is easily seduced and manipulated by the judge, who's really the one in control here. But Glanton takes out one of the revolvers and starts shooting cats and a bird and a goat, or a chicken and a goat. And the Mexican authorities come out and say, what's going on out here? And the judge, with his eloquence, he's very good at seducing people with his eloquence. And this is another opposition between the judge and the kid. The judge speaks in long, eloquent, learned sentences. He's a master of all kinds of different languages. He can speak Dutch and English and Spanish and you name it. Whereas the kid speaks hardly in the narrative at all. He's extremely laconic. And so that's another opposition between the two of them. And the judge is able to manipulate people with his words. So he calms down the sergeant, Sergeant Aguilar, and he introduces the sergeant around and schmoozes him basically, and then so they leave. Then as they're wandering along, they come across this group of gypsies, gypsy performers, entertainers and magicians, and a juggler. Glanton seems vaguely amused, and he says, if you want to ride along with us, you got to go to the back of the group. So they ride, and they set up camp for the night for an evening's entertainment with this little troupe, like the troupe that appears in Hamlet. Now note that McCarthy is always making references back to other works of great literature, such as the fact that when they were getting ready to leave with Captain White, the kid was leaving with Captain White, there was a Mennonite priest there who warned them of the doom that would befall their expedition, and that they would be arrested by the authorities as soon as they crossed the river. And that is an echo of the preacher Elijah in Moby Dick, who warns about the doom that will come to the expedition. And so he's always linking back to great works of literature. And here I think he's borrowed from Hamlet the troupe of players that shows up to go and perform the Mousetrap, the play within a play that's in Hamlet. But here what they do instead of a play is a tarot card reading. And it's not just a random thing. McCarthy clearly has studied the tarot and knows what the cards mean. There are 4 cards, 3 that surface and 1 that remains hidden mysteriously. Now note that too, that motif that Jung always talks about, this motif that in any given 4, any given grouping of 4, which he calls a mandala or a quaternio, there's always a 3-to-1 relationship. There's always an odd one out for some mysterious reason. Jung's reason is that the odd one out is buried in the unconscious, and it has not yet been brought up to the light of consciousness. But it's weird. It plays itself out in all kinds of forms, like the 4 smokestacks on the Titanic. 3 of those function. The 4th one's just there for ornamental purposes. I mean, it's bizarre. Once you notice that 3-to-1 relationship, you'll start seeing it everywhere. And so here we have three tarot cards, and one that McCarthy talks about but is never shown. And the woman who's doing the fortune telling has a blindfold over her head. So she's reading these cards blindfolded while the juggler picks them. And now there are 2 Jacksons, a black Jackson and a white Jackson, and they both hate each other. They're both named John Jackson, and they absolutely hate each other. And when they're first introduced, and I think it was the beginning of this chapter where they were first introduced, yes, the white Jackson likes to ride behind the black Jackson and keep in his shadow in order to keep the sunlight off him. At least that's the literal reason. But it's kind of a creepy thing. I love McCarthy's eye for these kinds of details. It's like he's leeching, like he's a parasite on the black Jackson or something, or it has something to do with the Jungian shadow. Either way, they hate each other, and the group has made bets on who's going to kill each other first. And so the first card that is drawn is for the black Jackson, and it's the card of the Fool, which is an obvious choice for him. He is foolish, as we'll see. What he does to the white Jackson is murder him in the next chapter by chopping off his head. But he's confused, and he thinks he's being made fun of. And the judge says, well, are you a drinking man? And he says, well, no more than some. And he says, well, maybe she's warning you to be careful with that rum. And indeed, in the next chapter, when he cuts off the white Jackson's head, he is drunk. So it does seem to be a warning. All these cards are warnings, actually. They're intrinsic to the plot. They're not random. Then the kid's card is drawn, Quattro de Copas, the 4 of Cups. Now, the 4 of Cups is a card that features a man sitting cross-legged with a tree behind him, with his back against the tree. And there are, again, the 3-to-1. There are 3 cups down below, and then a 4th one is hovering in the air like a cloud is bringing it toward him. Note that the cup is a female symbol. It's receptive, whereas the wands, let's say the equivalent card, the 4 of Wands, is phallic, obviously. So it's an inward receptive card, but the card itself means depression and remorse and regret. And so it appears to be an appropriate card to choose for the kid. Indeed, he comes to a sad end at the end of the novel when the judge kills him. And then Glanton. A card is drawn for Glanton, and it turns out to be the Chariot, although the wind blows it out of his hand as soon as he draws it. But the blind woman sees, however she sees, that it's the Chariot, which is a card that shows a chariot being pulled by a pair of sphinxes. But the card means transportation. It has to do with anything that has to do with transportation. If it's right side up, it's good. But if it's inverted, every one of these cards, if they're inverted, they have an opposite set of meanings. And turning that card around means disaster. it means sudden misfortune. And so clearly it's a foreshadowing of Glanton's fate when he is massacred at the ferry going across the Colorado by the Yuma. So it's clearly a foreshadowing of that. Then the one card, interestingly, that does not appear is the card of the High Priestess, which McCarthy mentions, but it never surfaces. But he goes to the trouble of mentioning it, and this shows a woman seated on a throne with the two pillars that are associated with the Masonic tradition, the two pillars that symbolize the two pillars in front of Solomon's temple, Jachin and Boaz, and the right side symbolizes mercy, and the left side symbolizes severity, and it's the same symbolism in the Kabbalah, where the right hand, Chesed, symbolizes mercy, and the left hand, Gevura, symbolizes strength. But the left side is the severe side. And so these are the two pillars, mercy and severity, that the kid is caught between. And I believe at the end the judge murders him and tells him that he's doing it because he was too soft on the Indians, too merciful. So all this connects up together very nicely. And then in chapter 8, there's a lot of wandering around. There's a bar scene. And then the point of the chapter ends, of course, with the confrontation between the two Jacksons. Finally comes to a head when one night the white Jackson is sitting around a campfire at night drinking, and the black Jackson pulls up and sits down at the other end of the fire, and white Jackson takes issue with him sitting there, so he pulls out his revolver and he cocks it, and black Jackson gets up and disappears off into the darkness. The guy puts his gun away, but then the black Jackson surfaces behind him with a gigantic Bowie knife and slices off his head in one swoop. I don't know if that's possible to do in one swoop, but he does it, and the head just simply rolls off, and the body just sits there, seated in front of the campfire the whole night. Nobody touches it, nobody moves it. It's there again the next morning, like some weird anchorite that McCarthy compares it to. That's the beginnings of the internal disintegration of the group. This is the first internal dissension within the group that results in a murder, and they gradually sort of suffer this sort of autoimmune disease that slowly disintegrates the group from within. And then in chapter 9, Glanton has already taken his first scalp, which I believe was in the preceding chapter at the end of chapter 7. They'd come into a village where there was a single, lone, and apparently deranged old Native American woman, and Glanton simply shoots her through the forehead and scalps her. And that's the first scalping that occurs in the novel. The second is done by the judge when they are hiding out under some creosote bushes from Apache that are approaching in the distance. And Toadvine is lying down, and he shoots with his rifle and hits the Apache and his horse and kills him. The others leave, but it's the judge who has the right to the spoils since he's the senior. So he goes over there, takes the valuables off the body and the scalp, of course, which is the primary possession. The Native Americans apparently believe that scalping a victim prevents their soul from leaving their body. It prevents them from getting into the happy hunting grounds. That is their version of paradise. So then the judge does his scalping, and then this wonderful scene occurs in chapter 9 of the Presidio, which is, again, another just incredible scene. It reminds me of like something out of Apocalypse Now, especially Apocalypse Now Redux, the long version. It reminds me of the rain-soaked MASH unit that they come across, where they're just barely hanging on, and nobody seems to know what's going on or who's in charge. So they come to this Presidio, and they go onto the inside of it into the courtyard, and they see a half-eaten mule. So these guys, there are 4 of them there, but one of them has been shot and is lying against a wall, dying. And the other 3 have been chewing away at this mule. That's the only food that they have. And there's this mysterious 12-year-old boy where no explanation is given, but significantly it's the judge who asks about him, and no one responds. They find him dead the next morning with his neck broken, and again, there's no explanation for that. And then we have this wonderful image of the snake-bitten horse. They only have 2 living animals, one they can ride, and then this horse that a rattlesnake has bitten on its nose. And again, another wonderful McCarthy image where the head is just bulbous and misshapen and it's sort of lopsided, and the skin is split open. And they're like, why don't you shoot this fucking thing? And they're like, well, we thought we'd just let it die. We might have to eat it. They're like, you're going to eat it even though it's got snake venom in it? And they're like, We don't know. If it comes to that, they might have to. And I think that no matter who directs this as a film, it's never going to be done right, just like Moby Dick has never been done right, because I can already tell that any talent that they hire to direct this movie will leave these details out as inessential. We don't need to see a horse with a squashed head, even though you've never seen that in a Western before, ever, not once, not in a single film. It's a totally original image. But some jerk-off director will get behind the reins and eliminate those kinds of details. You won't see the dead babies hanging from the tree, which is the whole point of the savagery. There's never been a filmed Western that is as savage as this novel, because the whole point of it is that the Mexican-American War has brutalized people on both sides, reducing them to the level of animals. They're basically no better than animals. It was a terrible war, and it was just off the charts in terms of the severity and the cruelty, especially of Anglos against Indians, Mexicans against Indians, Indians against whites, everyone against everyone. It truly was nearly apocalyptic, and that's the atmosphere that McCarthy wants to convey here. And I'm sure some asshole director will get in there and say, no, this is a great Western. These guys are great heroes. And they'll leave all these kind of details out that Coppola, for instance, would not. Apocalypse Now wouldn't be Apocalypse Now if it had just been left up to John Milius' screenplay, who just sees it as an adventure film, a simple, trashy, one-dimensional adventure film, which it is not. The details in that movie are what make that movie the greatest film ever made, just as McCarthy's eye for the gruesome details in this novel. They wake up and the guy's sitting there without a head at the campfire all night. Those kinds of details imprint on the mind's eye, and you will never forget them ever. Even if you forget the plot of the novel, you'll remember those images, and McCarthy knows it. He knows what he's doing. This is the greatest Western ever written for precisely this reason. McCarthy's eye for very gruesome or very original details that nobody else would bother themselves about. And so that's the scene with the presidio. And then we get the wonderful chapter 10, which is a sort of prequel to the Glanton Gang, in which the kid is working on some leather and listening while Tobin, who is an ex-priest, tells him the tale of how they came across the judge. And he said that they came across him. He was sitting on a rock out in the middle of nowhere with no horse, and just sitting there. And when they pulled up to him, he was smiling as though he'd been expecting them. Now, the implication here, there has been another foreshadowing in the previous section in the Presidio, where the judge was bringing in some ore and looking at it and talking about different kinds of ores. McCarthy doesn't go into detail about it, but that's a foreshadowing of the judge's connection with the realm of mineralogy, the geological stratum. And this is, of course, the stratum that in Christian myth is connected with Satan and the devil and demons. And there are myths about such demons emerging out of rocks and so forth. And so the implication of the judge just sitting there on this rock is that he was born from the rock, not literally, but the mythological implication is that he was born from the rock, like Mithras. Mithras is a god who was born from a rock and who was god of Roman soldiers. And also in the Chinese novel, Journey to the West, the character there, Monkey, in the beginning, is also born from a rock. That's the implication. But they've all run out of gunpowder, and they don't know what to do about it. But the judge happens to know how to make gunpowder. And so there's a long disquisition on how to make gunpowder out of saltpeter and charcoal, burning willow or alder, and then also brimstone, which is a form of sulfur that grows around the rim of a volcano. And so they do indeed come across a volcano where the judge finds the missing ingredient, sulfur, works on it, and then pisses on it, and has the other men piss on it. And this is taken actually from an issue of Foxfire number 5 on how to make gunpowder. And the guy in there says that I did indeed piss on it, and it improved the mixture 100% by oxygenating it more somehow, whatever that means. But it made it more efficient. But now, once again, McCarthy's eye for myth is here. There is an Aztec myth that the god Quetzalcoatl created men by the gods gathering around in a circle taking out their phalluses, cutting them, each one of them with an obsidian blade, and each one of the gods in this circle bleeds the blood into the mixture of earth that then Quetzalcoatl needs, like dough, to create the first humans. And so they're in Mexico here, so I find this interesting that this sort of echo of that myth finds its way in here to the making not of humans, but to the making of a material, gunpowder, for killing other humans. So this is a making of death. And there is a suggestion of a kind of Mephistophelian or Faustian pact between Glanton and the judge. Glanton basically does, the moment the judge shows up, they hit it right off. And Glanton basically takes the group in any direction that the judge tells them to go, unquestioningly. He just has implicit faith in this guy. He knows everything. He can give a disquisition on any subject whatsoever. And so there's a kind of Faustian suggestion of a bargain there between the two of them. So they make the gunpowder, and it works. They go up to the rim of the volcano with their rifles and shoot out over the rim of the volcano at these Apaches, which have been tracking them for a while, and then shoot them all dead. And they, of course, would have been massacred had they not come across the judge, who happened to know how to make gunpowder. And so we'll leave it there for those 5 chapters, and we'll resume with the next 5 chapters in the next video, which will carry us down to chapter 16, I believe.